He was a great moral teacher, apparently, and there was one time when he was walking through the city, this was Athens, and he asked for all the men to gather around and hear him. And so all the men in the city hear him, and they start to gather around. And basically, more or less, he says, "What are you guys doing here? I asked for men." And they're all, of course, very offended by that. What it reminded me of was something that was said to Jeremiah in Jeremiah 5, verse 1. See, Jeremiah was told to kind of do a similar thing that Diogenes was doing. He says, "Run to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem. Look and take note. Search her squares and see if you can find a man." And so what was so uncommon, apparently, in the Gentile world of Diogenes was also, apparently, not so common among the Hebrews. But what is it in men that we're looking for but find missing? What was it about those men that they wanted to find in their respective cities but they couldn't find? What is it that makes a man, in other words? Well, this verse actually describes it for us. It describes what it means by a man, one who does justice and seeks truth. A real man, then, is one who lives up to, basically, the potential that he finds inside of him. And how important is it that we find such men in our society? Well, to God, it was of utmost importance because he said finding these men would determine whether or not Jerusalem was going to be pardoned. I mean, that's how important it was. It's of utmost importance. If a society doesn't have real men, then it doesn't have long to live. And yet that's exactly our problem today. We have a human creatures very plentiful, but men very scarce. We have so few who are willing to stand up for what's right even when those around them are failing to do so. Few men of strength who have the power to defend against evil what needs defending. Few men of courage who have the heart to tell the truth. Few men who have truly mastered themselves and have their own houses set in order. They've taken the plank out of their eyes that they may see clearly enough to improve the lives of others. What we have today, essentially, those are the three things I really mentioned, is a crisis in masculinity. Now, I know this is a popular, I would say, social issue as well. Maybe it's been dragged into the political sphere too much. But I wanted to mention something. Have you all seen the Gillette razor blade ad that everyone hates so much? Have you heard about it before? Apparently there's when I've seen it, saw it when it came out earlier this year. It's just a razor company, but they came out with this ad, and the basic theme of it was trying to get rid of what they would call toxic masculinity. And the conservatives and a lot of Christians too really didn't like it at all. Basically, I'll just kind of run it down for you in case you didn't see it, was you kind of start out and you see men kind of looking at themselves in the mirror and they look ashamed, and you hear, the what is it, the little jingle that Gillette always has, the best a man can get. And so the question is asked, is this the best a man can get? And you hear different news recordings in the background of, sexual abuse and violence and toxic masculinity. And so the question's asked, is this the best a man can get? And so you see different examples of different things. What you see really are four main things, as far as I was able to see looking at the ad, was you saw men doing a bunch of bad things. There was lasciviousness, for one, inappropriate behavior. There was condescension, especially towards women, treating them as if they were inferior. There was abuse. There was a lot of bullying. And then there was also passivity, bad things happening. Let's say kids fighting each other, and the fathers are sitting there just saying, well, boys will be boys. And so the idea was that we've got to start changing this. And then there was a shift in the commercial, and it showed men kind of standing up and actually taking a good and positive role inside of those things. Like a father takes his son, or he's with his son, and he sees that some kids are chasing another kid and trying to rob him, and he goes and he stops them. And the boy sees his father do that. You have one of the men that sees two boys fight, one bullying and fighting the other, and he goes up and he breaks them apart and says, that's not how we treat each other. You have someone that sees an attractive woman on the street and he's about to go and bother her, and his friend stops him and says, it's not the polite thing to do. And so you kind of have it kind of turned around at the end. And the thing is, when I describe it to you that way, if you've never seen it before, you might think, well, that actually sounds pretty good, doesn't it? And that's what I thought when I first watched it. I didn't understand why all the conservatives and Christians had such a problem with that idea. Because the fact is, that's exactly what we've been talking about for decades in the church, was that we've got a problem in our society, and that's that men, too often, act like pigs. They're lascivious, they condescend, they abuse, they're passive. I mean, we've been speaking about this for a long time, and now when someone with different views from us starts to say the same things, we want to back away from that. Now, I think, however, the problem with the idea, as I've said, of toxic masculinity is, and you might say attached to that is the idea of patriarchy, right? Those two terms often go together. The thing is, toxic and domineering men do exist, but that's not what a mature man is. Those are boys pretending to be men. What we need is not less masculinity, but more of it. It's only the weak and impotent who are violent and abusive because they're compensating for something they don't have. The secure, the mature masculine, it doesn't need to abuse. It doesn't need to dominate. Mature masculine protects and loves and is respectful because he respects himself. So we need more mature masculinity in our society, if only to defend against that shadowy and immature masculinity that arises in its place. The thing is, boys fear women. They also fear real men. And I think that's the thing you're seeing. And I heard this quote once. I really liked it. It was, "Be the type of man in whose presence you would not dare to sin." And we're missing that, you know. You think about I always think about the West Point Academy code. One of it was, a West Point cadet does not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. And I think that's mostly the problem. Is it's not enough that we don't have good, upstanding men that seek justice and love mercy and walk humbly with God. It's we don't have enough men that are willing to stand up to those who don't. But the problem is that many think that it's masculinity itself, in its essence, which is toxic and abusive. So if you have that trait of masculinity, you are necessarily going to be abusive. And in such a view, it's really an animalistic quality. It's something which needs to be civilized out of young boys, right? We need to teach them as soon as we can to get in touch with the feminine side and get rid of that violent tendency and basically to eradicate masculinity altogether. But the problem is, once you've done that, you realize that you threw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, we don't have very many men anymore who will provide for their families, guide their children, protect the innocent. Because we've emasculated our entire culture. And the church. Don't even get me started on that. That's something we'll have to talk about eventually. But basically you can see, just as the decadence of Rome caused the barbarians to come at the gates, and just as the disarming of the Jews caused the Nazi tanks to be able to roll in, I think now more than ever, we understand the need for real men. But where are they? Well, they're right here. They're all around you. The problem is, a lot of us don't realize what we're supposed to be. What's happened is something that C.S. Lewis told us about. We've removed the organ and we've demanded the function. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. So there are a lot of different ways that we have suffered because we don't have a strong sense of masculinity in our culture. You can see how it's had its social effects. First of all, economically. We definitely suffered economically because of that. The thing is, most of the households in America that fall under the poverty line are single-parent households. And it's not the single father usually that's there, it's a single mother. The father has abandoned them. That is almost, I would say, if I can remember the statistic correctly, more like 70% of all households under poverty line is because there's not a father there to help take care of the family. But we, of course, know, as it says in 1 Timothy 5:8, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially for the members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. We're also suffering educationally. I mean, the fact that so many men have left the educational system, we can see, has hurt us in general. There are so few men all around the country in our churches that are willing to teach Bible classes, that's especially the children's Bible classes. That's something I've found to be a problem. But more importantly, the men aren't teaching their children in their own homes. Of course, we know from Ephesians 6:4 that fathers are kind of given that primary task for teaching their children. I think it's important that Paul, when talking about parenting, he doesn't say, mothers, discipline or bring up your children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Of course, mothers are supposed to do that as well, but I think the point is that the primary responsibility for the instruction, spiritual and otherwise, of the children is the father's. It belongs to him. And that is something that goes back all the way to the beginnings of biblical tradition. In Deuteronomy 6:6-7, the idea was that you were supposed to pass down the traditions from God, from father to son. It says, these words that I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. But because men haven't been fulfilling that responsibility, we can see the educational detriment that we've had in our culture. Socially, though, our people, our men, they're not being involved. And if you go to the charitable organizations in any town in the United States, most of the people involved in anything on a public level, increasingly, it's women. And of course, we see that in the church, too, the social aspect of the church. How many people are the ones that are usually coming to the different get-togethers and that sort of thing. You can see, and I think it's the case here, but it's the case here because it's the case everywhere else, which is usually the women are a lot more involved than most of the men are. And you can see that all across the society. And I think it's an interesting thing that David, when his time came to die, he commanded his son Solomon, saying this. He said, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. And he says, be strong, therefore, and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways, keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, his testimonies, as it is written in the law of God, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. See, the thing about giving him this advice is that Solomon, being the king of Israel, has a very public role. He's got a responsibility before his society to fulfill these principles that his father is laying down for him. It's not just about him, in other words. For Solomon, the idea was, you are responsible for an entire people. You have a responsibility to make something out of yourself, not just for yourself, but for those around you. And that applies to every single man in every single society. And I think it's interesting that you can see this. I love this phrase. There's so much packed into this about Jesus and his growth as a human being. Luke 2:52, there's of course the idea of him increasing in wisdom and in stature, which is interesting enough. But focus on the last part. He increased in favor with God and in favor with man. And you have to think how Jesus, to accomplish what he wanted to, he had to make sure that in some basic level, people liked him. He had a responsibility for the people outside of his own household and outside of his own mind. And I think that's one thing that we are losing with our young men is social responsibility and social involvement. You don't see it anymore. And you can see the detriments because we don't have it. On a more fundamental level, we're suffering morally. I think if you abandon certain standards, then you're going to abandon certain blessings. Of course, what is it that was expected of a man before? In Micah 6:8, what is asked of you? He has told you, old man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with your God. And I really love this verse. It's probably one of my favorite ones in the whole New Testament. 1 John 2:14, John says, he mentions men in here. He's writing to women and he's writing to men. And when he mentions the men, he says this, I write to you, fathers, because you know him who is from the beginning. And listen to this. I write to you, young men, because you are strong. And the word of God abides in you, and you have overcome the evil one. How many times do you hear that said to a group of young men? That's not the general assumption we have in our culture right now. The general assumption is that if you're a young man, you don't really have anything put together. And I was thinking about this. It's really an interesting thing. I was talking to my sister about this. We have some differing views regarding roles of men and women, but on a friendly level, at least now that we don't live together. She was saying, we're talking about an interesting trend in both in literature and you could say in movies. Now you can see the same thing, which was now when you look at say, general characters, like take sitcoms for instance. That's probably the most obvious thing, just normal shows and sitcoms. You see the woman now, like since the 70s, let's say, you've got very competent women, right? They've got it together. Like you always have every now and then the comedic woman that doesn't, but generally speaking, the idea was you want to portray women as very strong and powerful and competent because you didn't like that former idea of women not being able to do anything. And fair enough, The problem is you also have the men in these shows, and they're completely stupid. They just have no idea what they're doing. And they're usually the comedic relief. And, it is funny, and I don't imagine that people made those shows for the express reason of trying to, berate men. But it is, I think, important, the fundamental assumptions we have in our culture about the nature of men and women. Because you see, the thing is, in ancient times, it was almost exactly the reverse. If you read some of the ancient, especially the Greek literature, you'll find that usually if you're going to assume that one gender over another doesn't really have their life put together, it's usually the women. And the men were, but the thing was, associated with that was men were expected to kind of have their act together. And, you could say, although there are some problems with that view, also some blessings go along when there's this expectation that if you're a man, you're going to have yourself put together. That expectation is completely gone. The idea, and I've heard this taught surprisingly even in the church, isn't it strange that, have you ever heard of like the Purity Day thing? The girls, when I was a kid especially, in a lot of churches of Christ, and other more conservative, even other groups like the evangelical conservative groups, they'd have the girls get together and have instead of like a girls' day, it was themed around purity, sexual purity, and it was for the girls. It was called a Purity Day, and you've probably seen fathers will give their daughters purity rings when they get to the puberty age, and that sort of thing, and they'll really emphasize that. But the funny, that's all wonderful, of course. Funny thing is, they never did that for the boys. I always thought, and I thought about it even as a teenage boy, thinking, how come we don't ever have purity days? It even sounded kind of funny to say that the boys would have a purity day. And that's a really interesting thing, and I've heard it said by many different people that it's the girl's responsibility to make sure that the boys aren't lusting for them. It's the girl's responsibility to make sure that they don't go too far in their dating and in their relationships with them. It always is falling on the girl. And it's like, now wait a second. I see a contradiction here. See, the thing is, in the church, we teach that men in homes and in the church have a leadership position, right? Am I right? All right. Except in this, where when it comes to our temptations, the women have to have it down because the men aren't going to. Isn't that kind of hypocritical? I think the thing is, with leadership comes responsibility. And you can't say, just because I'm a man, I can't control my passions. John begged to differ. Even to the young men, you can. He's assumed that those men he's writing to, that they have overcome the evil one. I think the thing is, and the fact is, when you look at the way things actually are, most guys don't have it together. And I think the very reason is because we don't expect them to. And this is something that has affected us morally in our culture and in the church being affected by them. So let's go to the positive side of this a little bit. There are three basic functions that man has on a natural level, and of course to be a real and good and full man, you don't necessarily have to fulfill all of them. Like, for instance, the idea of having children. That is a natural function of manhood, but that's the general principle. It's not always the specific situation. Your situation will vary. But basically, I think the three P's of manhood, as they've often been called, I didn't invent this idea, kind of serve as at least some sort of fundamental basis for what men were designed to be. And you can see this on a natural level and on a supernatural one. So let's look at this. What is it that we should be expecting of our men? What is it that has been expected of men since the beginning of time? The first thing is that men ought to be protectors. That's our role. And we can kind of understand that on a fundamental, natural level too, right? For instance, it's really interesting to me that the word manhood, early on in ancient cultures, Gentile and Jewish, the association with manliness and manhood was always kind of a warfare type of term. It's like if you're considered manly, it means you can fight. That's kind of the idea, is that you can protect what you need to protect. You can see an example of this in 2 Samuel 10:12. Joab is talking to the Israelites, and they're about to go and fight, and he says, "Be of good courage, and let us be courageous for our people." Or as some translations say, they translate it literally, and it is, "Let us play the men for our people." So they're synonymous. The idea of being courageous in battle was the same thing as being a man. So in other words, if you couldn't be courageous in battle, there wasn't much about you that you could call manly. He says, "Let us play the men for our people and for the cities of our God, and do what seems good to him. But it doesn't just stay on that level. I think it's really interesting that Paul takes the same term, actually kind of the same phrase, in 1 Corinthians 16:13, and he's talking about protecting the faith, defending the church, and this is a spiritual thing, but he also attaches this idea to the idea of masculinity, of true and virtuous manhood. He says, "Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong." See, that's what's expected of a man from God, that he can protect physically and spiritually what needs protecting. You can understand it on a physical level, and I think I want to explain this a little bit because people have a problem with this idea. They think it's a very sexist idea that the men specifically have to be the protectors. But you have to ask the question, why is it through most of the history of the world, the armies of the nations have all almost universally consisted of men? And it's based on biology, right? I mean, I'm sure there are some of you in here who have taught school and maybe have taught biology in class, and you probably understand, as I'm sure most of us would that have just lived normal lives, that the average man has a higher, say, muscle percentage than the average woman. And of course, that's average, and on certain extremes you'll find differences, but generally speaking, like if we pit Bill against Laura, I'm pretty sure I know who would win, you know. Of course, Laura, he may not be sure, but I'm pretty sure. You know, I think, and that's something you can see. Really what it is if you go to the extreme, you can really see it. Look at the sports, especially the strength and the sort of track and field, especially the strength and power sports. If you look at all the highest world records, you know, of heaviest weight lifted and all the different events and that sort of thing, all of them are men, without exception. That's something I do know. So anyway, it's based in biology. It doesn't make a woman less valuable, right? It just means there are certain strengths that men have. That's why men have been, in that sense, as a matter of fact, it's funny that a lot of people consider this to be sexist, because the thing is, it actually is a little bit worse off for the men. Because what it means in a society is men are more expendable, right? You've got women, think about it on a natural level. Women, they're the ones that have children. You can't send them off to war. That wouldn't make sense for protecting your village, right? The men go off to war. They're more expendable. The women are, in that sense, for the preservation of your society, they're infinitely more valuable. And so you're going to see that men, in that sense, actually put themselves in greater risk. And you've probably heard that. You know, all the most dangerous jobs, even today, are still mostly operated by men. Most of the people that join the army today are still mostly men. Even when women can go into the military, men mostly still do. So I think there's an important reason for this, and it's based in fact. It's not based in some ideological sexism. It's the truth. And so along with that ability comes responsibility. If you can do something good, then you ought to try. The second thing about what's expected of a man is that he can provide. And this is based all the way in Genesis. If you remember in Genesis 2:15, God took the man, put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. And when the curse comes, remember the curse that he gave to Eve and the curse he gave to Adam. The one to Adam was essentially surrounding the idea of the provider. It's like by the sweat of your face, by the sweat of your brow will you bring forth fruit from the earth, right? So you've kind of got that as the lot of man. And traditionally you can see that usually the men have been primarily the providers. Now, in that you can see that it will start to change in a culture when there are different types of jobs. You know, when you get to a basic level, you kind of have to look at this stuff kind of on a primitive level, like in a primitive society, what would have been mostly like. And you can see that in that case, the responsibility for providing food and that sort of thing would have fallen on the men more. But now you have specialization so much, like in a culture so advanced as us, to where it's just as easy for anyone of any sort of, let's say, physical stature or health or whatever, to go out and to get a job. I mean, before a job wasn't a thing. Like you go out and you hunt a deer and you kill it and you bring it back to eat. And not everyone can do that. And most of the people that could were men. And now it's not quite the same. You know, most of our jobs, very many of our jobs, are more intellectually based. So you could see that would change. But the thing is, when you take away that fundamental, I think, spiritual responsibility for a man to be the provider, you can see what sort of detrimental effects it will have on a culture. Because it goes beyond the physical, it goes to the spiritual. I think it's interesting that Paul talks about that was it in 1 Timothy 2, and I desire that in every place the men should pray, lifting up holy hands without anger and quarreling. And he goes on to say, talk about relationships between men and women in worship, and how the women ought to be submissive, quiet. The men have the responsibility for teaching. And that's the same, I think, as the spiritual level of provision. It's the same idea behind it's the same idea behind training, the father having that primary responsibility to train a child. It's like you're the provider, physically and spiritually. That's a responsibility you have. It's been given to you by God, and we ought not to neglect it. Now last, this is having to do with having children, but I think rather than procreation, which has more to do with actual childbearing, creation itself is an important idea, because there are ways. The thing about having children is what you're doing, essentially, is you're giving something to the world, something of you that lives on. And hopefully you can instill the same principles that you lived by, if they were good, and that person or those people that can kind of carry on your legacy that way. So you've hopefully contributed something positive to the world and haven't just taken from it. That's the idea, as far as I see it, of having children. But you can do that in other ways. There are other works that you can put out into the world that can have a positive effect after you. So I wouldn't just limit this to simply having children. But you can see on a natural level that's where it would start. And God in the beginning had, of course, Adam and Eve as a part of that idea and the plan for being fruitful and multiplying and subduing the earth and filling it. But of course it continues on. The idea of having children and not training them up, not being a real father, not actually putting something positive out into the world, it defeats the purpose. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. So these are the types of things that we should be looking for, I think. The types of things we really should expect of men, to grow up to be protectors and providers and to create things, good things in the world, not just to take, but to give. But that's kind of general, One thing that I really believe in is the power of story and inspirational narrative to inspire people to become those things, because that's the real content of it. That's the thing about stories and the importance of all the narratives that you have in the Bible is they show you what happened, but they also show you how to live. Paul talks about how all the events that happened to the Israelites, they were written not just so we can know some history, but also they serve as an example, both positive and negative, to show us what we ought to do and what we ought not to do. And so I want to present you next week, whenever I get to it again, probably next week, I want to go into certain kind of primary images, let's say, or as some people have called them, archetypes. And I think the idea of an image is probably more explanatory, that you'll find, especially as we'll look in the Scriptures, the images of what men are. And they're often the reason they're called archetypes is because they fit similar patterns, and you'll see the same types of characters in different stories. And we'll see that as we go through the Scriptures, and we'll look at the different men that we can hold up to ourselves as examples for what men ought to be, and examples of what you ought not to be. With every good image, there's a shadow image, There is something that you ought to avoid. Now there are four, and I didn't invent this either. This is commonly talked about groupings of images, but there are four different ones that I think about and that you can find good examples for. And I think the funny and the cool thing is about this is that you can find these images in other places. The fact is, as much as we would like it, our children are always just immersed in the stories of Scripture. They're out in the world too, and they see movies and they hear songs, and they're exposed to other things. The good news is there are a lot of good things in those other things. And you can see these same images that you'll find in Scripture, and you'll see them in some form or other, an imperfect form, of course, but you'll see them in other places. And so I think what we ought to try to do is train ourselves to see those good things out in the world. And one of this, here's the way I'll phrase this. We need more stories with these types of characters that our boys may see and grow up to be. Warriors who fight for good causes. Kings who rule with benevolence and protect their subjects. Wise men who teach secret wisdom and enlighten the world. And men who are not afraid to love that which is good and true and beautiful. There are a lot of places these stories may be found, as I mentioned, and I mean, that's one thing too I wanted to mention is you may have noticed I like to read a lot, and I really like different stories, and And I've had people ask me before, especially ones that had young boys, either sons or grandsons or whatever, to ask me, what sort of things should my sons be reading, and that sort of thing, like on a secular level, other books like that. I really like when that conversation comes up, because there are so many good things out there written by good people, that have these same truths in them, And so I think that's important, and anyone, of course, can always ask me about that. But of course, the most valuable and rich source for them is the Scriptures. They are going to show us what a man ought to be. Because the thing is, once God himself became a man, and he showed all men how to live. He was the protector of mankind. He saved us from our sins. He was the provider for his sheep. He provided for us salvation and every blessing we could possibly imagine. And he's the creator of everything. He's even been called, interestingly enough in Isaiah, the everlasting Father. That's another topic in itself. In him all things will be put together and redeemed. So it's true that manhood is transmitted from men to men. If you want to learn to be a real man, then you have to learn it from real men. What better place to look than the only man that was ever perfect? So I offer this invitation to us all this morning, men and women, to look to Jesus. Because it's in him you'll find what you were meant to be. Your destiny lies in him. Because this urging that you have to be something, to make something of yourself. You know the feeling I'm talking about. Nobody wants to grow up to be something mediocre, right? Nobody, when they started school and decided, what do you want to be when you grow up? Nobody has this image of them being just a loser. Like, that's not what you want for your life. You want to become something. We become mediocre because it's actually hard in the world to be what we thought we could be. And so what happens is, because of the expectations or lack of expectations that we have, we simply start to believe that we can't be those things, even when we would desperately want to be. In fact, perhaps that desire is often repressed and chalked up to nothing but romanticism and foolishness. But the fact is, we can be those things. It's just very hard. But where do you think that urging comes from? The potential inside of you that's waiting to be awakened. It comes from God. And it's a gift from God to you. Now I know that you women in here might feel left out this evening. I'm sorry about that. But we need you in this too. And we need you to know these things. Because without women there would be no men. And as a matter of fact, of course, the first level of a man growing into such is when he's a boy. And he's held and he's taught and he's fed and he's nurtured by his mother. So all of us have an equally important role in this. And I think we ought to start thinking about these things, because it's more than just a spiritual crisis. It's an existential one. We can see the physical, social, economic, moral effects it's having on our culture. And I am a young man, and I was a younger man not too long ago. I was a teenager not too long ago. And I understand to some degree what young men are facing now. And it frightens me to death that they don't know who they are. They don't understand how valuable they are. It's this really strange and terrible thing that many of our teachers and many of our leaders in our society have been doing, whether consciously or not, to tell a young boy that what he is in his core, evil. That's the worst thing I could possibly imagine. Because there's so much good that can be accomplished by a man in his fullness. Nothing can compare to that. The potential inside of you is waiting to awaken. And so I ask you all to arise this evening and to become the man or the woman that you were designed to be. If you have a need to fulfill that destiny, then come forward now as we stand and sing.